We will now proceed with the first presentation on behalf of the Baker Institute of the Enron Prize for Distinguished Public Service. I'd like to call to the podium Secretary of State James A. Baker III.
Ladies and gentlemen, when Ken Lay and I had our initial discussions about setting up this Enron Prize, we had no specific individual or individuals in mind. What we did have was an idea, and a simple one, and that is that the award should be used to honor an individual who represents the very highest standards of public service. And today's recipient is very definitely such an individual. Colin Powell's life, with its now famous rise from modest beginnings to vast public acclaim, embodies, I think, the essence of the American dream. Colin's career, with its progression from combat officer in Vietnam to highly respected chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Gulf War, reflects the very best of the American military tradition. And Colin Powell's character, with its professional excellence, its personal integrity, and a profound sense of duty, represents an ideal toward which all Americans, young and old, should strive. As a nation, we have been blessed with a tradition of soldier statesmen, individuals who see military issues in the broader context of national security and national security in the broader context of our democratic society. George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower were two such soldier statesmen, and I think that they have a worthy successor in Colin Powell. I've been very privileged to have worked with Colin, and I'm honored to call him a friend. But I'm also grateful, just as a citizen of this country, for the invaluable services that he's rendered our nation in war and in peace. He is one of the most respected men in the nation today, and I believe that this public affection is a tribute not just to Colin Powell, but to the American people who know a real hero when they see one. I know that I speak for everyone here when I say how very much we appreciate General Powell's willingness to find time in his hectic schedule to join us here today. Now let me introduce to you Ken Lay. Most of you in the audience know that Ken is chairman and CEO of Enron, an energy company that ranks among the world's very largest. He is a distinguished economist, one of the nation's most successful businessmen, a highly respected civic leader, and I'm proud to say, one of the strongest supporters of the Baker Institute since its very beginning. We've grown to depend on Ken's commitment and to depend upon Ken's counsel. And we are delighted that Enron has decided to establish a prize to honor excellence in public service. After all, public service is what the Baker Institute is all about. And excellence is what Ken Lay has stood for his entire life. That makes it all the more appropriate that he helped present the Enron Award today. Ken Lay.
Thank you, Jim, and it's always nice to be in such esteemed company. And ladies and gentlemen, the Enron Prize for Distinguished Public Service acknowledges individuals who fully dedicate their talents and abilities to the benefit of others. As to the impact of such an individual on the lives of others and his or her contributions to society, I believe our recipient today is literally off the scales. Only a small percentage of individuals make a true commitment to public service because the opportunities for greater economic incentive, more individual influence, and fewer limitations on personal style and creativity are far too compelling. The ideals behind the Enron Prize for Distinguished Public Service deserve society's highest accolade, especially since we are a society that moves quickly and often makes initial yet lasting character judgments based on fleeting circumstances and changing conditions. It is essential that individuals receive recognition for their contributions to the public good because it is individuals, not organizations or associations or assemblies, who fill in the cracks and smooth out the ragged edges after traditional working meetings and strategy sessions have ended for the night. One has only to look to the military forces of the United States, the unique and creative individuals who submit to working as one cohesive unit, despite the circumstances, despite the criticisms, and despite the outcome of their good faith efforts to see that commitment at its best. The individual who dedicates his or her life to public service rarely is privy to personal recognition on a timely and deserving basis, because true public service is the achievement of a lifetime. It is nurtured by experience, the happiness, pain, solitude, and familiarity of daily life. It is tested by the trials of personal growth, unforeseen obstacles, and unanticipated peaks and valleys. It is mellowed by maturity, by taking a step back from the immediacy of the situation to allow the entire spectrum of influences to complete the picture. Enron is pleased, indeed we're delighted, that General Colin Powell is the first recipient of the Enron Prize for Distinguished Public Service. General Powell has embraced a commitment to public service with an exceptional depth of character, which is also, of course, the word that I noticed Jim used. His footprints, I might say his boot prints, have left unique and lasting impressions across international thresholds in the form of courage, vision, and dedication. General Powell's life reflects the choices of an individual who at an early age sought to grow not only from a formal means of education, but also from an education enriched by his environment and his contemporaries. He has used these experiences as a foundation for learning, to the point that he has admirably shared his knowledge and insight as a leader, teacher, commander, and certainly a role model. Though he has been a high-profile newsmaker and a highly coveted soundbite, Colin, I expect much more from time to time than you even preferred, over the last couple of years, he is a testament to the steadfast truth that distinguished public service is indeed a lifetime pursuit and an award in itself. And I have to add, I'm sure I speak for many in this audience, and of course for millions around the country, in saying we deeply regret you decided that you did not have the passion, at least not at this time, to run for the presidency of the United States. But we thank you, General Powell, for your contributions and for a vision that continues to renew itself in the lives of all who have benefited from your personal commitment to public service. Now, Jim, I think you're going to come up and make the presentation, General Powell. Is that right? Over here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to read the inscription on the award before Colin speaks to you. It says, "In recognition of his outstanding contributions to the foreign policy and national security of the United States of America, the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy awards the Enron Prize for Distinguished Public Service to General Colin L. Powell at Rice University, November 1995. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. Would you mind if I address the audience, please, sir?
Cartel to obtain the conviction for General Noriega, and that the Khalid cartel was a partner with the Ndara government, which you helped put into power.
Let's give him a round of applause. Maybe he'll leave. Secretary Baker, President Gillis, Dr. Lay, Secretary Duncan, Ambassador Derigian, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon and a very great honor for me to be the first recipient of the Baker Institute's Enron Prize for Distinguished Public Service. And I want to thank the Institute and I want to thank Enron for this recognition. I gave a press conference last week, which some of you may have noticed. And as was mentioned by Ken, in one of the most difficult decisions I've ever had to make in my life, elected at this time to continue my service to the nation in private life. But I also said at that time I wanted to continue to speak out on the issues of the day. I wanted to be part of the public debate. And so I am pleased to begin this new phase of my career, this new phase of my life, right here at the inaugural conference of the Baker Institute, a good place to start it. The Baker Institute is an exciting new venture, and I congratulate Jim for his vision and for giving his time, his energy, and his talent to this project. And the Institute also represents a very successful collaboration in the best sense of the word between the corporate leaders of Houston and the leaders of Rice University, a center of academic and intellectual excellence. And the location of the Institute here in the southwest part of the United States seems to me shows the growing importance of this region of our nation. And I'm sure from this place a fresh perspective will be added to the various perspectives coming from the most prestigious public policy institutes of the nation. The focus of the Institute, as you know, will be on an interdisciplinary approach, and that's really a mirror of Jim Baker's life and career. Under Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State, Chief of Staff to a President, a man immersed in politics and even called his book The Politics of Diplomacy. He knows that all of the boundaries that used to divide these various issues of economics and finance and international relations and domestic issues have all fallen away, and it is all one central issue which must be addressed in an interdisciplinary way. He is a man of action, he says in his book, not that much of reflection. That's not the Jim Baker I worked with in the Reagan White House or in the Bush White House. He is a man of great action, a man of great reflection as well, and a man who is a practitioner and not just an academician in an institute-like setting. So I think great things will come from this institute, from somebody who helped shape the ending of the Cold War, somebody who helped negotiate the most far-reaching treaties that we have seen in our lifetime, the Secretary of State who guided our diplomatic efforts through several conflicts, a practitioner. And I must also say that I believe you are enormously fortunate to have as your director Ambassador Derigian, an old friend of mine in the same mold of Jim Baker, solid intellectual but also an action-oriented individual. And there's much to be done here at the Institute because we're moving, as you all well know, from a world that was very, very dangerous, but within all of that immense danger there was rule. There were rules that defined behavior to contain the danger. But now we're moving to a world that certainly isn't as dangerous as the Cold War was. But with the end of containment, we have lost the rules that gave us the means to make appropriate choices. Armies no longer will be staring at each other across curtains. Nations are less able to ignore domestic needs in order to sacrifice for some greater interest, such as defending themselves against a hostile empire. New rules are needed. Old assumptions need to be rooted out. New dangers must be analyzed and dealt with. Old enemies, old adversaries are now becoming economic competitors using the principles of democracy and free markets that we told them was the way to go, and now they are following. So there'll be new elements of power, new ways of competing, and the ideas and structure that we will need to deal with this new world will emerge from places of learning, places of study, and places of introspection, such as the Baker Institute. And I predict that this will be one of the leading institutes of that kind. And so it's a great pleasure for me to be with you here today. I wish the Institute every possible success, and I am deeply honored to be the first recipient of the Baker Institute Enron Prize. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If you'll all hold your places who have passes for the second panel, we will reconfigure the stage and we will proceed with the panel as soon as we're ready. Thank you very much.
Microphones are powerful things, and they're now working, so I'm delighted. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second panel of the inaugural annual conference of the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy here at Rice University. I'm Marvin Kalb, director of the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. We're pursuing the theme today and again tomorrow morning, the conference itself, which is Foreign Policy Challenges at the End of the Century. Our second panel addresses warfare in the post-Cold War world. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and indeed throughout all of Eastern Europe, it appeared that the potential for military conflict had dropped dramatically. Yet since that time, there have been major conflicts throughout the world. We have seen both the kind of conventional warfare that we anticipated would be fought between East and Western Europe, and a variety of bitter internal conflicts as well. Our panelists will face the difficult task of making sense of all of this. Very few people have made sense of all of this, so don't feel too bad. We're particularly interested in the role of warfare in the pursuit of national security, whether it will show new forms or whether it will be fought in ways that are familiar to us all. Before I introduce the panelists, once again, as I did this morning, I would like to state to all of you in the audience that you do have an opportunity to ask questions yourselves. I know that a number of you picked up cards as you entered the hall this afternoon. If you fill out the card and raise your hand, an usher will stop by and pick up the question. I assume that will follow your hearing what it is that the panel says. But at any point in the course of this panel discussion, if you want to say something, you want to ask a question, write it down, an usher will come by and then bring it up to Ambassador Deregian, and the selections then will be made. Now, let me get right to it and introduce our distinguished panelists. His Excellency Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Federal Chancellor of Germany. His Excellency Roland Dumas, who has served France twice as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Third, General Colin Powell, former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Bush and Clinton administrations, National Security Advisor under President Reagan. The other 7 members of our panel, the Honorable Paul Wolfowitz, Dean of the Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and a former Undersecretary of Defense and our Ambassador to Indonesia. Dr. Catherine McCardle-Kelleher serves as Secretary of Defense Perry's personal representative in Europe and defense advisor to the U.S. Ambassador in NATO. Dr. Bruce Russett, the Chair of the International Relations and Political Science Department at Yale University. Don Oberdorfer, former Washington Post diplomatic correspondent who is presently a distinguished resident scholar journalist at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Charles Herman, Director of the George Bush School of Government and Public Policy. Mr. Ralph Begleiter, CNN's World Affairs correspondent and co-anchor of the program called The International Hour. And Dr. Martin Van Cleveld, professor at the History Department of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. We will now start, as we did this morning, with 3 of our panelists talking to us for about 10 minutes or so, and then the other panelists will talk to us for about 2 to 3 minutes or so, and that is only to open the discussion. And we start with Minister Genscher. Right from there is fine, sir, wherever you are.
Ladies and gentlemen, invited to speak about political military factors and the future of warfare, I will speak about the perspectives of a just and stable peace order from Vancouver to Vladivostok, the main aim of which is to avoid future warfare. Almost exactly 6 years ago, on the 9th of November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall marked the end of the division of Germany and of Europe, as well as the end of the East-West confrontation. The political contribution of the United States, and in particular President Bush and Secretary Baker, was of paramount importance for the establishment of German unity. We Germans will never forget the firm position of our friends at that turning point of European and German history. Now we have to face new challenges of global dimensions. But having overcome the East-West confrontation in a peaceful way remains a historic success of the transatlantic partnership. Almost 20 years ago, in 1967, the Atlantic Alliance adopted a new strategy for its policy vis-à-vis the whole of Europe. The so-called Harmel Report pinpointed the division of Germany as the core of the tensions in Europe and advocated efforts to overcome the division of Germany and Europe. It furthermore called for a just and stable peace order throughout Europe as its prime political aim. With a view to this aim, the Harmel Report mapped out a double strategy: maintaining an adequate military strength of the alliance on the one hand, and the policy détente vis-à-vis the Soviet Union and Central and Eastern European countries dominated by the Soviet Union on the other hand. This strategy of security and détente and the strong, cohesive alliance were the essential preconditions for the dramatic changes which took place in Central and Eastern Europe in the years 1989 and 90. The CSCE, as the main instrument of a multilateral détente policy, provided a stable framework for the peaceful and revolutionary change in Europe. Today, the United Germany, as West Germany before, is anchored in NATO and in the European Union as the two main pillars of security and stability in Europe. With German unity and the end of the East-West conflict, one aim of the Harmel Report has been achieved. However, the alliance's goal of a just and stable peace order for the whole of Europe continues to remain unfulfilled. And more it becomes obvious that the cohesion of the alliance is of crucial importance for stability in a changing world. For the space from Vancouver to Vladivostok, we therefore need a NATO Harmel Report number 2, which would have to sort out the relationship between the Euro-Atlantic institutions, such as NATO, the European Union, the Western European Union, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, and the Partnership for Peace. Furthermore, one has to define the role of Russia and the other successor states of the Soviet Union, as well as the former members of the Warsaw Pact, in a security architecture from Vancouver to Vladivostok. The basic principles of such a just and stable peace order were laid down in the Charter of Paris for a New Europe from 1990. The respect for democracy and human rights, prosperity through economic freedom, as well as social justice and equal security for all OSCE countries. We need the Euro-Atlantic framework in which the countries in the area from Vancouver to Vladivostok are linked closer and closer together by a network of mutually supporting institutions to form the Euro-Atlantic Stability Area. With a view to this aim, NATO, and in consequence the American engagement in Europe, remains of paramount importance, as recently demonstrated again by the development in Bosnia. The strength of the alliance never resulted only from its military capabilities, but also from its common values, from its political cohesion, and its ability to act. There is a historic need for closer cooperation because of new global challenges to security and stability in the post-Cold War era, and such as a worldwide proliferation of means of mass destruction, worldwide economic and social injustices, and ecological threats. We have to safeguard the rights of minorities, and we have to fight organized crime, international terrorism, and fundamentalist tendencies which are not limited to Islamic circles only. The future will show that these global challenges affect all countries from Vancouver to Vladivostok, regardless of their former system or position. Nationalism, however, is the main enemy of the nations in Europe, and it can only be avoided by an ever closer cooperation. This underlines the importance of the European Union and of the unique relationship between Germany and France. And I'm happy to be invited together with my good old friend Roland Dumas, and I would ask him to convey all our best wishes to the great European statesman François Mitterrand. Europeans will only be able to cope with the global problems through common action in the framework of a working transatlantic partnership, as mapped out already in the Transatlantic Declaration of 1990. At the same time, the transatlantic partnership has to be complemented by a comprehensive partnership between Russia as well as with the other CIS states. NATO and the European Union have made indispensable contributions to stability and prosperity in Europe over the last decade. The European Union has, by conclusion of the so-called Agreement on Association with the Central and Southeastern European countries, offered to them the perspective of full membership in the Union once they fulfill the preconditions. Such agreements will also have to be concluded with Slovenia and, much farther down the road, with the successor states of the former Yugoslavia and with Albania as well. Furthermore, the European Union has acknowledged the paramount importance of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the other successor states of the former Soviet Union for stability in the whole of Europe, and the United States rightfully accept Russia as a strategic partner. NATO, too, has actively responded to the revolutionary changes in Central and Eastern Europe, first by extending the hand of friendship to its former adversaries, then by shaping new cooperative security structures such as the North Atlantic Cooperation Council and the Partnership for Peace programs. Now the alliance needs a clear concept, and it should never forget the overriding importance of maintaining the cohesion and its capacity to act, as well as contributing to stability and security without creating new dividing lines through Europe. The recent unprepared and unstructured debate on the extension of NATO to the East has shown the problems of a debate without having previously agreed on a clear concept. Therefore, the discussion on NATO enlargement should not prejudice the discussion on the concept for a just and stable peace order from Vancouver to Vladivostok, should not precede a Hamel Report 2. This requires in particular an enhanced cooperation between NATO and all European countries, including Russia, in the framework of a comprehensive security partnership. A just and stable peace order in the whole of Europe can only be achieved with, but never against, Russia. Accordingly, The United States are rightfully striving for cooperation between NATO and Russia in the framework of the peace implementation process in Bosnia. In addition, the West should take Russia seriously as a global partner in the G7, where we work closely together with our Japanese friends. Russia should become a fully fledged member of the future G8. The OSCE remains an indispensable element for a just and stable peace order from Vancouver to Vladivostok. The OSCE represents the only institution in which all states between Vancouver and Vladivostok, including the United States, Canada, and Russia, participate. With a view to the new security threats, the OSCE's capacities, in particular in the field of conflict prevention and conflict management, should be improved. The OSCE will only be able to respond to the new challenges if it is enabled to act more effectively. This requires a number of new initiatives, such as establishing a legally binding basis for the OSCE and improving its decision-making structure. The OSCE is in a similar position as the United Nations. Both organizations cannot work more effectively than their main member states allow them to do. This requires in particular the fulfillment of all obligations by the member states. Safeguarding peace and stability in the whole of Europe will depend essentially on a working transatlantic partnership. In the post-Cold War era, the United States and the European Union continue to share a wide range of common political, economic, and strategic interests. In a time of change, we should be open for new forms of transatlantic cooperation. In the Transatlantic Declaration of 1990, the European Union and the USA and Canada re-emphasized their commitment to strengthen their close links in order to achieve their common goals and objectives. With a view to this aim, the conclusion of a transatlantic treaty should lay the basis for an ever closer cooperation in all important questions of mutual interest. The New World Order requires close cooperation and not confrontation between the global players all over the world. This underlines the increasing importance of closer cooperation with China in dealing with the global challenges. The same applies to other countries and regions in the world. There's no more way for a policy of self-isolation. The stability of the New World Order and the new global challenges require cooperation between all global players. The better the transatlantic partnership works, and the better the United States of America assume their international responsibility, the better for global stability. That is what never should be forgotten by the Americans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you very much, sir. It's my pleasure to introduce Roland Dumas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say first how happy I am to be here for these days. And I would like to thank my good and old friend Jim Baker for this invitation. And I will thank everybody who have been working for the success of this conference. I wish you the best, and I'm sure that it will be. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like just to make a few comments on the problem we have to deal with today. Talking about political and military factors and the future, I think we can agree to say that the year 1989, 1990 was a year which completely changed the post-war world. We can agree to say also that today the world has not yet found its new political strategic equilibrium. This is for several and significant reasons. The world order that we hoped for has only been partly achieved. The disappearance of the Soviet Union and the end of the communist ideology have let loose the forces of nationalism with confrontations that lead to local conflicts. Look at the Balkans, look at Yugoslavia. Against the background of liberty and independence, which nevertheless represent real progress. All this has created a precarious situation full of contradictions. Lastly, but not the least, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of people who are often uncontrolled or irresponsible has taken the place of the old balance of terror without creating a new real system. What remedies for the future, for the next 5 years, can we suggest to meet this new situation? I think personally we have to explore for the next years 3 directions, which are the main elements for a new stability. I shall mainly consider the approach relating the alliance, Europe, and the United Nations. The alliance, the NATO first. The problem for the moment and for the near future is not the problem of the transformation of the alliance. This is the problem, very delicate question, of its extension. I frankly will say that we must at all costs avoid the extension of the military organization, I say the military organization of the alliance, to the Eastern European countries. This deserves a short explanation. Let us not forget that for 50 years, the threat of being in a cycle was a pretext invoked by the Soviet Union for its overarmament, its glacis, and the Cold War policy. The Warsaw Pact is no more, but the NATO, on the other hand, exists. Russia would very quickly go back to the old doctrines of the threat of encirclement, especially as it no longer has the protective curtain that existed before the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. Utmost caution is required, therefore, in this area to deal with this problem. Second question, Europe. You know that France was deeply engaged in the construction of Europe, especially with our neighbor Germany, and it is for me a great pleasure to greet my good friend Hans-Dietrich, who has been working with me during years and years to go further on the way of the construction of Europe. And I thank him for the word he said for the President Mitterrand. We should strengthen the European Union and not hesitate to make the Western Europe Union the real pillar of the alliance. Anything that weakens the European Union and the double EU in the field of defense will make the alliance more fragile. Moreover, for the former members of the Warsaw Pact, the prospect of the accession to the strong double EU, giving a form of access to the alliance, could be an acceptable substitute, on a condition, however, that whatever offer was made to them was genuine. At the same time, a strong WEU would be less of a threat to Russia, and it would give protection to the former Warsaw Pact countries. Third point, lastly, United Nations. This year, the UN is celebrating its 50th anniversary, but it no longer corresponds to what the world needs. As is often the case around the age of 50, energy tends to decline. UN must therefore be reformed, deeply reformed. For instance, Germany must be a member of the Security Council, as well as Japan. The organization must be given the financial means to do its job. And what is most important, its role must be better defined in conflict prevention, repression of crimes against mankind, and the defense of human rights. The Secretary General's doctrine, for instance, on preventive diplomacy merits, in my view, serious study and a positive response. The setting up of a world criminal court with the powers of enforcement is a must. The ongoing experiment with the Tribunal for Judging Crimes Committed in Yugoslavia is proving slowly useful. One might mention in passing that this French initiative is meeting with some success day after day. This tribunal should be made a permanent agency of the United Nations, reinforced. These are some ideas I wanted to present you on our subject. I thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce General Colin Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Calv. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. And I will speak, of course, from a military perspective and tell you what it's like to go through this transition that you've just heard about from the revolution of 1989 through 1993 and now into the present. I'm intrigued by the title of this panel, The Future of Warfare. It almost has a plaintive quality to it, as if we're afraid warfare will have no future. Regrettably, it will. In fact, during the 4 years I was chairman, we deployed the armed forces of the United States some 28 different times. Sometimes to war, sometimes to peacekeeping, sometimes to peacemaking, sometimes to peacemaking in our own cities, the Los Angeles riots, sometimes for earthquake relief, tornado relief, Desert Storm, Panama, surgical use of force over Manila one night that helped a democratic government stay in power. But the kind of warfare we really had thought about and planned about for 50 years is gone, no longer there. And we're looking at new forms of warfare, and we're trying to make sure that within the armed forces of the United States and the armed forces of our allies, we have the right capabilities to deal with this new form of warfare. But to show you how rapidly it has changed, let me just take you back to a day in 1988 when I was privileged to be in Moscow with Secretary of State then George Shultz and Minister Bashmertnik, who is here with us today. And in a sidebar conversation, Mr. Gorbachev, then President of the Soviet Union, smiled to me and said, "Well, General, the Cold War is over. What are you going to do now that you've lost your best enemy?" And it was a shocking statement. I said, "Well, I hope you won't, go too quickly. Let me retire first and get out of the way." Because with that statement, he was essentially saying that everything you have known, everything you have studied, everything you and your generals and admirals have been doing for the last 40 years are going to now have to be changed. All the assumptions are different. There is not going to be a high-intensity, massive war in the central plains of Europe that might start in the Middle East, explode to Europe, and explode around the world and produce World War III. That is gone as the central defining form of warfare that you have been worried about for the last 50 years. And we saw that happened with the withdrawal of the Soviet armies, the ending of the Soviet Union, the CFE Treaty, and the release of the nations of the Warsaw Pact. In the United States, as we watched these changes, but at the same time found ourselves caught up with all of these other operations that came along, we had to dismiss all of those World War III, Cold War assumptions, and working very closely with my distinguished friend here, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at that time, Paul Wolfowitz, and Undersecretary Cheney's leadership, and working with Secretary Baker and his associates and the rest of the Bush National Security team, we got rid of those World War III assumptions and said, no, that's not what we're going to have to face. What are we going to have to face? And the first strategic answer that came to us was the most threatening form of warfare we can face are regional conflicts, one perhaps in the Persian Gulf, where not only do we have what we might call vital interests, but certainly essential regional interests. The oil of the Middle East can never be allowed to fall into hostile hands. And then we looked at Asia, and we realized that our presence in Asia for many, many years had been a source of stability, and we wanted to continue that stability. And there was always the potential of a conflict in Asia on the Korean Peninsula. So as we moved away from our Cold War assumptions, the form of warfare we were most concerned about were these two major regional contingencies, and we sized and shaped our forces for them. And it was called the two major regional contingency strategy, and we brought our forces down over the years from 1989 to the present by almost 30%, and paid a peace dividend back to the American people. But we tried to do it in a way that we did not break our armed forces. We did not demobilize the way we had done after previous conflicts. And we felt that was important because we knew warfare still had a future. We knew that there would be challenges to us. We knew that there would be people who would take advantage of this new, still unformed post-Cold War environment, and we had to be ready for that. And those challenges came along, as you know, from Desert Storm, and our success in Desert Storm proved that we were able to meet the challenge and not break apart our forces. The challenge for the future now, however, will be that I believe that the world is continuing to move in a positive direction. Not every place, not everywhere, not every nation, but for the most part, the world of promise that is emerging is a world that will no longer form its security basis around armies staring at one another across borders. The security for that world will be brought about by trade, by capital flow, by information flow, by open markets, by GATT, by NAFTA, by similar devices which create huge trading networks, and the competition will be in that manner. I also believe that places such as North Korea are anachronisms. There's no reason for us to believe that it isn't heading the same way that every other similar nation in the world went as we watched the revolution of 1989 unfold. And in due course, as I have suggested to my friends in the Pentagon, my successors in the Pentagon, this transitional strategy of just basing our force structure on two major regional contingencies may only last a few years. As we see historic changes take place in the Korean Peninsula, and if possibly the peace process that's now occurring in the Middle East continues to spread to the east and changes the total dynamic situation in the Persian Gulf region, so that that would not be an adequate sizing mechanism for our forces. We anticipated that we couldn't keep just building forces based on specific threats. And so during the Bush administration, we started to change the basis of our planning from threat only to capability. In other words, we could no longer see the future as clearly as to what kind of wars we would be facing, what kind of situations we might get into. It might be a much smaller, sharp conflict. It might be peacekeeping, but robust kind of peacekeeping where we had to be ready to fight. It might be responding to a nuclear proliferating nation. It might be one of 100 different scenarios that we really couldn't be sure of any longer. No longer the nice, simple, strategic problem of watching the Red Army and NATO grinding each other along the Iron Curtain. A very, very unclear world. So the important thing was to make sure the armed forces of the United States had the capability within the force for whatever might come along. Robust, capable, multidisciplinary, full array of forces with the ability to project power anywhere in the world quickly, with the ability to have presence on station to deter conflict. And that's why keeping some number of troops in Europe is important. That's why keeping our commitment in the Pacific to about 100,000 troops is important. We must have the mobility forces to move our troops there. We must have the very best intelligence and command and control systems in order to control those forces. That's the real advantage the United States brings to any situation. And so the kind of wars we will face in the future, unknown. More likely, they will not be wars of the World War II or even Desert Storm variety. Bosnia will be a test. We have made a political commitment that if there is a proper agreement that everybody has faith in, the United States, the President has committed troops to peacekeeping there. But they have to be strong enough and the right kind of forces so that if peacekeeping isn't enough, they can do some peacemaking and make sure they can always defend themselves. This is probably more typical of the type of conflicts that will come along, the type of places where our young sons and daughters will have to go into harm's way. Increasingly, however, it will be more difficult to write a policy statement that can link what we are doing to a clear, vital interest of ours. And without that policy statement that links it to a clear, vital interest, there is always a risk that you may not be able to keep the support of the American people over time and when things start to go a little rocky. And that will be the greatest challenge for our politicians as well as our armed forces as they go into these various conflict situations. So in short, in a period of 6 years, we have gone from a set of assumptions which called for the most sophisticated, highest quality, large standing forces and massive reserves to fight against a similarly equipped force in Europe and see that war expand around the world to a situation where we're dealing with regional conflicts, and in time, those major regional conflicts that size our forces now may also no longer be as relevant, and the force may get smaller. But the important thing is the future is still an unknown. The future ain't going to be what it's supposed to be. We will end up fighting in some place we never thought we would be fighting. We'll end up deploying forces in some place where we didn't even know we had a map for. And when that time comes, we have to make sure that we have kept available to the President, to the Congress, to the American people, quality armed force, well-equipped, well-led, and a high state of readiness with the most technologically sophisticated equipment American industry can produce, and with the full support of the American people behind that force. That's the challenge, whatever the future of warfare turns out to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, General Powell. Now, with three principal presenters now having completed their statements, I call upon the 7 members of the panel to respond, present their own original thoughts in sprightly, crisp 2 to 3 minute packages, starting with Paul Wolfowitz.
On the plane coming here, I read the new issue of Newsweek, and after reading the article about General Powell, I went to the section I usually go to first. It's something called conventional wisdom. There are little arrows about what's up and what's down. And in thinking about my remarks here, I thought I would do it that way. I think as we look to the future, uncertainty is up, danger is down, technological change is up, budgets are down, and the future of our alliances is uncertain. Let me, in 3 minutes, try to explain behind that. I think the fact that uncertainty is up is perhaps the most significant fact of our time. When President Bush and Secretary Baker went to the 1990 summit of the NATO leaders in London, the summit that declared the end of the Cold War, Margaret Thatcher, who was the host of the conference, opened it by saying, "Europe stands today at the dawn of a new era, as promising in its own way as 1919 and 1945. I think there were a few people who missed the irony, but clearly what she meant was that promise of 1919 and 1945 could also be lost in 1990. But I doubt if even she would have predicted that less than a month later, we would be launching the largest post-war deployment of American forces to defend against an Iraqi threat in the Gulf that virtually no one had predicted. And I think that is the fundamental point to remember, and it doesn't mean that panels like this that try to predict the future are futile, but it does mean that policies that are based on a sense that we know the future really are to be questioned. I don't think you can find anyone in the early 1920s who would have dared to predict that a then prostrate Germany might within 20 years nearly conquer the world. You can in fact find a Secretary of the Navy of Warren Harding's administration who predicted that the Washington naval treaties had made a naval war of aggression across the Pacific virtually impossible. I think when you hear words like virtually certain or virtually impossible, it's time to check your wallet. At the same time, in fact, we face a world today with dangers that no one predicted. The most bloody war in Europe since the end of World War II happened right at the end of the Cold War when we thought peace was at hand. But dangers are down. As Secretary Baker said eloquently this morning, we don't face the prospect of a nuclear war that could destroy the entire world in a matter of minutes. We don't face the prospect of many divisions poised to conquer whole continents in the space of a few weeks. What we face is a great many smaller dangers, and our challenge, I think, is trying to keep them small. I don't think technology is exactly on our side in this regard, however, because we are facing a period of revolutionary technological change. That has great benefits in the civilian sector. On the whole, it brings uncertainty and unpredictability in the military area. I think the analogy to where we may be today is the technological revolution that took place in the 1920s and 1930s. And what brought about World War II was not just a political revolution, but the fact that the bad guys in that revolution mastered the new technology. The technology that is revolutionizing your office, your home computer, that same technology, I think, is revolutionizing warfare. We saw a glimpse of it in the Gulf War, those spectacular missiles turning corners down the streets of Baghdad. But remember that that technology was mostly the technology of the mid-1970s or late 1970s. And as I think most of you know, the information revolution, the technology of data processing is changing on the order of magnitude, a factor of 10 every 2 years. We're way beyond that generation, and we haven't seen the end of it. And we haven't seen the application of it to military forces. Yes, we're number one in the world, and by a very wide margin. General Motors thought that for a long time. IBM thought that for a long time. One way to end up in the cellar is to keep telling yourself you're number one. We have to remain innovative. But the fourth thing is our budgets are going down. They've come down enormously already. Some haven't noticed it because it's still a very big number. But we're down more than 40% from the peak of the Cold War. And it's going to come lower. We're now, in terms of a percentage of GNP, spending less on defense than any time since the eve of Pearl Harbor. We have fewer people in the armed forces than any time since the eve of the Korean War. When you mention those, obviously those are not monuments of American military preparedness. However, there is something very different from where we are today and where we were in 1940. And that difference, I think, is that all of the strong countries of the world are on our side. We don't face the prospect, at least in the near term, of major countries that could turn against us. And that brings me to the last point on my list, and that is the future of our alliances. I think what produces this stable world is very large measure the coherence, the unity of the major industrial democracies of the world. I think our challenge is to build on that unity, to extend security, in fact, to countries of Central Europe and even to Russia, and not to retreat into a view that we can take care of our security by ourselves because, after all, there are no threats left in the world. That, to me, is the greatest danger to our future. General Powell and I had a colleague in the Pentagon who was I guess, a born pessimist, and he used to say with a sardonic smile, unfortunately, warfare has a bright future. I think our challenge is to prove him wrong, and I think we can. But the worst thing we could do is to believe that it's not a problem.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Professor Van Creveld, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We are all very glad that the Cold War has come to an end. But, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that as both forms of war are sinking below the horizon, new ones are rising. And the question is, are we ready to face them? I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that we are in the midst of a historical transition.
Yes, we cannot hear. It's difficult.
Thank you. I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that we are in the midst of a historical transition from interstate warfare to intrastate warfare, a period which sees the end of large-scale wars between states, but moves to wars inside states, wars in which the forces that we now maintain, the technologies that we now have, are and are going to be largely irrelevant. Wars which will not be fought by states and their armies, but by militias, terrorists, guerrillas, bandits, murderers, drug traffickers, and however you may choose to call them. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, at this very moment, there are approximately 30 wars going on all over the globe. Not one of them is fought by states, at least not on both sides. All of them, without exception, are being fought by different kinds of organizations. Again, at least on one side. Some of these wars are very bloody. Think of Somalia, think of Bosnia, think of Sri Lanka, think of Rwanda, and a dozen other places. Politically, too, they are very significant. In fact, you might argue that whereas since World War II, there has not been one single case in which a war between states succeeded in changing a border between countries by 1 inch. During that period, wars between other kinds of organizations have literally liberated entire continents and caused hundreds of millions, if not billions of people to change the political rule under which they lived. As Vietnam, as Afghanistan, as Somalia, as Chechnya, as Lebanon, and 1,000 other places show, we do not really know how to deal with these wars. We are intellectually, organizationally, technologically not ready for them. Nor is it a question of simply something that always necessarily happens far away. Wars between Kawami militias in little-known, far-away places. I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that no country is in principle immune to this new phenomenon. I suppose the French foreign minister who is here today could tell us more about that. Of course, as an Israeli, I could tell you a lot more about that. Not even this country, ladies and gentlemen, is necessarily immune. Look at the World Trade Center. Look at Oklahoma City. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, we don't really know how to deal with these wars. We don't really know how to think about them, because all our strategic theories, which all of them in one way or another go back to Clausewitz in the 19th century, are geared to a different kind of war. Not only don't we know how to deal with these wars, as a virtually endless series of failures shows, but we don't even know how to think about them. And moreover, from my experience, there are not many people who even want to learn how to think about them. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that now that the Cold War has ended, a new kind of war, a new kind of barbarians is standing just outside the gates. In fact, in many countries, they are already inside the gates. The question is, will we learn how to deal with them? So far, experience in that respect has not been encouraging. The question, moreover, is can we learn how to deal with them without becoming like them? And here I'd like to quote Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who once said, "He who fights a monster should beware not to become one oneself." That, I think, ladies and gentlemen, is maybe the greatest challenge of our times. And if this conference can do anything useful, then maybe it should consist above all of pointing a finger to that danger and saying, for heaven's sake, let's stop ignoring it. Let's stop pretending that it doesn't exist. Let's stop pretending that it's something that can happen only far away in unimportant, barbarian, out-of-the-way third world countries. It can happen here, it can happen tomorrow, and we'd better start thinking seriously about how to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much, Professor. Your comments have certainly opened the door to many questions, and I hope we'll be able to get to some of them when we get into our discussion phase. Dr. Kelleher, please.
After Professor von Krefeld's statement, it's hard perhaps to put forward a positive view, but I'd like to try it if I may, and particularly to pick up a theme that has been spoken about by several of the earlier speakers, namely the centrality of the kind of cooperation and cohesion that has existed within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the past and its continuation into the future. I'd like, if I could, to give a report that things are not going so badly, and that in fact, in the times of transition, with so much else going on, that really we have made a number of changes, a number of what I believe to be progressive steps towards continuing the kind of cooperation that brought us not just stability, but I think political reassurance during the long, cold nights of the Cold War. As Foreign Minister Genscher has already stressed, much of this has to do with the immediate problem on most of our minds, that is, how one brings the horror of Bosnia to an end. And here, I think, particularly over the last several months, one really has seen a reaffirmation of a number of the principles that have been at the cornerstone of NATO since its inception. The first is that we are all stronger when we work together, when we cooperate, however difficult and burdensome that may be. I think the second is that, viewed both from the American and from the European lens, American leadership is critical to the undertaking of any major task, political or military. What we've seen really in the last several months is a coming together after many months of discussion and division among the major allies on a common program of action, not perfect, not yet finished, but certainly moving in a direction that I think all of us hope will indeed come to a peaceful settlement of what has been such a difficult war. Beyond Bosnia, however, and the many changes that it's brought about in the actual mechanics of the alliance, I think there are two other things that I'd stress for a positive report. The first is something that's already been mentioned, the Partnership for Peace, which is a program which attempts to engage and bring into a cooperative relationship with the North Atlantic allies, now some 26, about to be 27 states, other European states, but clearly within the Vladivostok to Vancouver framework that Foreign Minister Genscher mentioned. Here, in a very short period of time, less than 2 years actually, there has been the evolution of a set of common norms, a reaffirmation of common values. Just to pick one, we see a number of agreements that have come about because of the pressure exerted through the alliance on the Central and East European states in ways perhaps, again, not always successful, but I think moving in the right direction. Hungary has sought, for example, agreements with both Slovakia and with Romania not yet fully completed, but on the right way, to provide for the respect for the rights of Hungarian minorities and the guarantee that Hungarian minority claims in Slovakia and Romania will not be a cause of war among those three states. For those who know the history of the Balkans, that's a fairly big step indeed. The second area is probably a relationship still evolving that both NATO and Russia are groping towards, which is some way to continue the engagement and the cooperative relationship with Russia itself, destined in most likely instances to remain outside of any formal alliance structure. Here, even in the last several months, again motivated by Bosnia, one has seen the mechanism of NATO meeting with Russia in continuing session to discuss the ways in which cooperation will go forward as, I think, a step in a positive direction. But there are limits to this positive report, and ones that, as General Powell underlined, must be made clear. Democracies are slow to act alone or together, to take timely action against conflicts as they emerge and as they are seen. How many times, at least in the horrible evolution of the Bosnian War, one has only thought, if we could have only had this level of agreement 6 months before or a year before on what the strategy was to be. The great temptation is not just to believe that there is no longer a need for that Cold War army, but that, in fact, unilateralism, always a temptation for the United States, is in fact the best course. We will decide, we will set the cost, we will determine whether we can, at least at this moment, afford the price or would like to. I think that, rather than isolationism, is the great challenge ahead of us. How do we continue to have political support, the support of the electorate, not just for budgets, not just for force structures, but for the risks that must be taken by the citizens of this country and other countries to preserve the kind of peace and stability we have seen as at least a goal in front of us. It is a challenge that I think is one that transcends all parties and that really goes to the heart of how one, as a democracy, as a democratic citizen, lives in an international community where the danger of conflict has not abated, but where the need for cooperative action, in fact, perhaps has increased.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keller. Ralph Begleiter now, who works for an organization that even has given birth to this CNN effect, whatever that be. Ralph Begleiter.
I stand before you, or sit before you here, as the very personification of the information revolution. And that's said in both a positive way and a negative way, because you've all experienced and seen the effects of international satellite age broadcasting on the conduct of warfare and policymaking. But I have to tell you that those of us involved in the revolution don't know where it's going either. I want to just tell you a little story that illustrates briefly the point I want to make. It's a very simple point. It wasn't very long ago when a Greek woman came up to me at a conference not unlike this one, and she walked right up to me and shook her fist in my face and said, "Mr. Begleiter, you have no right. You have no right to come into my home and teach my children something I don't want them to know." She said, "Every time you come on television, you talk about a place called Macedonia. And there is no place called Macedonia," she said. "My government doesn't want my children to know there's a place called Macedonia, and you keep calling it that. What right have you to do that?" Simple example, but it makes exactly the point, which is and this is a point several of our speakers today have spoken about. The information revolution is ignoring political boundaries. It's ignoring all the rules of the Cold War. Ask Boris Yeltsin about the conduct of the war in Chechnya and his desire, I'm sure, to have somehow controlled the new Russian media's broadcasting and live coverage and subsequent in-depth coverage of the tragedy to the Russian forces in Chechnya. Ask George Bush or Jim Baker about the conduct of the Gulf War and the attempt to hold together the coalition, a very fragile, delicate coalition for a long time, in the face of constant broadcasting by CNN and other international news organizations of criticism and attacks from every quarter of the world, every world spokesman having a podium on which to make his or her point. Talk to the United Nations and to NATO about the conduct of the war in Bosnia in the face of this information revolution, in which the Serbs and the Muslims both have access, direct access to me via the internet and fax machines and all kinds of modern methods of communication. Regardless of what government officials want to say or what UN officials want to say, these people all have a channel direct to CNN if they want to, taking advantage of this information revolution. Ask Colin Powell about what it was like to try to run a military operation against Saddam Hussein in the face of just constant broadcasting of every detail that CNN could find, could uncover, some of them accurate, some of them inaccurate, being flooded internationally, not only to friends and allies, but also to those that you might consider the enemy. And ask all of these people about the need, which many of them have talked about today, to maintain public support for any kind of policy, not just warfare, but for warfare especially. You need to maintain public support, and the way to do that is through the media. So at the same time as you're confronting the challenges of someone telling your children that there's a place called Macedonia, you're also confronting the need to inform your own public, sometimes using media that are outside your own national boundaries. I just returned from Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East, where there is a true information revolution going on, and the conduct of warfare in Syria, the whole concept of confrontation between Syria and Israel is changing because the Syrian people are seeing things they've never seen before. They're hearing things they've never heard before, even if their own government doesn't want to tell them. They're hearing about it through this information revolution. It's a point that is not really on the mark of the conduct of warfare, but it is definitely one of the politico-military factors that policymakers such as those on the podium here have to take increasingly into account as they conduct their policies and create them over the next decades.
Thank you, Ralph, very much. Thank you. Professor Russet.
Like the three opening speakers, I want to talk a bit about wars we don't have to prepare for, and in doing so, I will pick up on some comments from the three opening speakers, as well as bits and pieces from others. In doing that, I'll give you the same message, though more briefly, as I gave to a big symposium in Tokyo last March. The day of this symposium in Tokyo was March 12th. They were observing the 50th anniversary of the American firebombing of Tokyo. It was not the easiest spot for an American, a sole American, to be on display. My message then, however, was that whatever our political differences, and we will have them, so long as certain conditions are preserved, the American bombing would not happen again, and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would not happen again. That is, there would be no Japanese-American war again, providing three conditions were preserved. These three conditions being that both our countries remain democratic, that they both remain economically prosperous and interdependent, and that they both make use of the network of international organizations and international law that exists to help resolve differences between states. Underlying this message are three strong generalizations about the past that do give us guidance for the future. First, democracies virtually never go to war with each other. By war, in this instance, I mean something rather precise in the sense of big conflicts with substantial numbers of people being killed in organized interstate violence. Over the last 2 centuries, there are almost no exceptions to that generalization, and the closest things to exceptions that one can find are all in the 19th century, when democracy was much less fully developed than in more recent decades. Not only have there been no clear instances of war between democracies in the modern era, democracies are 10 times less likely to use military force against each other than are other kinds of states. That's even low-level uses of force, far below the level of war. That's the first generalization. Second one, economically interdependent countries rarely fight each other, especially since 1945. Very clear pattern since 1945. Economically interdependent countries have too much stake in each other's well-being, too much stake, that is, in the other's economy for goods, for markets, for capital investment. Thirdly, when they do have disputes with each other, democracies and economically interdependent countries are more likely to use peaceful instruments of international law and organization, regional and global organizations, for the mediation, arbitration, and adjudication of those disputes. Therefore, these 3 generalizations give us the elements for a zone of peace in the world that already exists, that can be sustained, and hopefully can be expanded. A zone of countries who not only don't fight each other, but don't even worry about a military threat from each other. A zone at the moment now both wider than NATO, but as yet less than global. And there's the challenge.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, Dr. Charles Sherman.
Several of our panelists have made the point that one of the biggest challenges we face is not to be trapped in our thinking of the past. And indeed, our very success makes the danger of being caught in a conceptual trap more difficult to avoid. I think 2 of the most important pillars of our success in the Cold War were, 1, the Atlantic Alliance and the NATO organization, which Minister Ginster has spoken so elegantly about, and 2, our commitment to strategic deterrence. I want to suggest to you that in the kinds of conflicts we are likely to face in the future, deterrence is going to be very difficult to apply. There are a number of reasons I could make for that, but I'll say those. I think, however, the problem is this, that if certain regimes, not in Europe, can't be persuaded to forego their most objectionable actions by non-military means, the United States will face some very difficult choices. We can turn our back on those interests. We can go it alone using the kinds of new forces that General Powell talked about, or we can hope and pray that we have in office the kind of talented leaders that we had with George Bush and James Baker, and Richard Cheney and Colin Powell, that can have the talent and the energy and the ability to create an ad hoc coalition on the spot. I think there's another alternative. That other alternative is to use our leadership to create new institutions, new structures, using NATO as a rough model to deal with the problems of stability in other parts of the world. We need to think about how we can energize and commit other states to take some responsibility for stability, for maintaining borders peacefully, for avoiding genocide throughout the world. What troubles me is as we move to the close of the century, with the exception of Europe, our international economic institutions are more robust and diverse than our security institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Don Oberdorfer.
Well, it's an obviously daunting prospect coming after all these speakers that have brought all these things to light, to try to make sense of the present and the future between now and the turn of the century, especially in 3 minutes. But to me, there are 2 or 3 things that could be said. First, although it may be strange for a journalist to say that, I think very much the future and present flow out of the past. The conflicts and problems of the post-Cold War world are fundamentally, most of them, flowing out of the circumstances of the Cold War. The big problems that we're going to face in the world, the problems of really global dimensions, are coming from essentially the losers in the Cold War. From the former Soviet Union, not only Russia, but its relationship with the states on its periphery, the near abroad, as it's called, Eastern Europe, the former Yugoslavia, broken apart by nationalism and strife. And in Asia, China, a great question mark. I agree, it's very much today on the right path, although I'm not sure what a socialist market economy really is. But China's relationship with the states on its periphery, which it considers really part of its sphere of influence, if not its country, Taiwan, Tibet, some of the states in the South China Sea. These are going to be the issues that are going to confront us, I think, between now and the turn of the century. To say nothing of those few remaining communist states, North Korea and Cuba, and what happens as they make what is going to be an inevitable change. So how do we deal with it? My view is the most fundamental thing to do is engage in preventative diplomacy. That is active diplomacy now to work with these big countries and the other countries involved to make sure that they do not become worldwide problems and spill over into strife. I'm worried about alliances and how we maintain them. And if I may be permitted a digression or perhaps a retort from something said earlier, with all respect to Professor von Krefeld, I think it's very important to maintain the distinction between wars and civil strife, murder, terrorism, and the like. If we begin to treat these as actual wars, I think we often are going to be going in the wrong direction, especially in this country. Finally, I agree very much with what President Bush and Secretary Baker, it seemed to me, were emphasizing in their nice, quiet way in their comments this morning. I think there's a great concern about the future direction of the United States, about whether this country is going to try to turn inward, something which, in my opinion, would be foolhardy in the extreme. But I think all of the signs are there in the Congress and elsewhere in our political parties that people are tempted to do that. I hope they don't do it. I think it would be courting a disaster, not only at the turn of the century, but beyond.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Don, very much. First, I would like to ask any member of the panel if he wishes to comment on anything that any other member of the panel said. Now, quickly, before we go to the questions. Good, you've had your chance. Now, a number of the major issues that have come up have to do with, and this was cited right up at the beginning by Ministers Genscher and Dumas, some new definition of the alliance and of global responsibility at this particular time. Ralph Begleiter, this information technology, will it even revolutionize warfare? Something that General Powell just mentioned in passing, the future direction of U.S. policy that Don Oberdorfer talked about, the need of the alliances for, my word, updating, but not discarding. And I'd like to start with that and perhaps put this question to Minister Genscher first. Do you feel that the alliance is currently structured, the NATO alliance is currently structured, really does have to be expanded to include nations from Eastern Europe? And if the answer to that question is yes, please tell us why.
First, I would like to remember that after the First World War, United States left Europe just after the war. And we all know what the outcome of that was. After the Second World War, United States decided to stay in Europe. And in the first line, not because of the Soviet Union, because at that time, United States counted Soviet Union as some kind of an ally. Decision was made to make a contribution by the United States to the economic reconstruction of Europe and to the unification of Europe. That should be never forgotten. And I think there are two major questions now to answer. First is, do the United States, after the third war in this century, I mean the Cold War, follow the bad example of 1918, or will they follow the good example of 45? That means, will they be involved in European affairs? And after having overcome the division of Europe, I have to speak of all European or the pan-European affairs. We as Europeans would prefer that the United States stay and remain and are aware of their real interests and also obligations.
Mr. Minister, are you concerned, are people in your country concerned about the rise of a neo-isolationism in the United States?
Yes, I'm concerned about some voices in that direction. And that is the reason for the appeal I made at the end of my speech, that every citizen in this country should be aware of the responsibility that the United States have all over the world, but in the first line I had in mind, of course, Europe being a European. So I personally am convinced that the existence of the Western Alliance is of vital importance, not only for the stability in Europe, but also for the stability all over the world, first. Second, European nations, as far as it was possible for them, decided to begin the process of unification, with a decisive role played by France and Germany. This was decisive because of our common history, but was not always a history of friendship, as we well know. So this cooperation was crucial for the success. And today we can say that the European Union of 15 countries is not only a great success, it is a zone of stability for Europe, not only for these 15 countries. So the enlargement of the European Union is one of the main tasks we have. And there are many countries in Central and southeastern Europe who want to become member of Poland, for example, Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltic states. They will do it step by step because they have to fulfill certain preconditions, what is absolutely right. What I would prefer is to give a clear date when we will start the negotiations for enlargement and to give a perspective or timetable when they can become full member. Let us say the year 2000 for full membership. Because that will include the new democracies in the group of the European democracies and taking into account that the Western European Union, that means the defense and military organization, which is connected with the European Union, is then open for them also. Third, now coming to your questions, this was a preparation. But responsible for the nature of an answer is the one who is asking. So the responsibility is on your side. Now we come to the extension. You know, there are many people say, we have the right to extend NATO. No doubt we have. No doubt we have the right. And all countries which have signed the final act of Helsinki have the right to join an alliance. When we discuss German unification, the main argument we used in our discussions with the leadership in Moscow was to say we, the Germans, have a right to stay in NATO and as far as East Germans are concerned, to join NATO. So this is absolutely right. But there's no one in the alliance who is ready to say which nations we are ready to take as members of the NATO. They will say Poland, of course. Czech Republic, of course. Then there will come one and what about the Baltic states? We heard that there's no veto right on the right of Moscow. Yeah, Baltic states is a different case. What does that mean? That's the reason why I find that we are well advised to have a Harmel II report, which gives some kind of blueprint for the whole of Europe, including Russia.
Mr. Minister, I want to...
Including all the means of cooperation, like Partnership in Peace, North Atlantic Cooperation Council. What is the position of Russia? What of Ukraine? What of Belarus? And then we can answer these questions. I'm deeply concerned that...
We have to move on, sir, please.
Pardon?
I said I would like to be able to move on to the other panel members, too.
Please, if you like to move,
No.
move.
I would like you...
Please go ahead. The next answer, which I think will be more or less similar to mine, should give my good friend Roland Dumas. So you have your right and I have my right.
Minister Duma, I want to go back to this point about neo-isolationism in the United States and the concerns you may have.
I don't want to say the contrary of what we said.
And also about the expansion of NATO, the central issue.
Well, I would throw out two wrong ideas. First of all, this is the situation of the American troops in Europe. Jim Baker knew that during 5 years we have been working together, and the public opinion in France and in Europe, and generally speaking, is in favor of the presence of the American troop in Europe, for all the reasons that Hans-Dietrich has said, but also because it is necessary for the equilibrium of Europe and of this part of the world, for peace, for equilibrium, for trying to solve our problems. And the second point I would like to mention, which is a wrong idea to us, is in Europe that the Americans are more or less against the construction of Europe for political, economic, and strategic reason. This is a wrong idea, I think. But the point is that in our difficulties for the moment, the American could help us, and particularly on the problem on the defense and the construction of Europe. Look, the NATO is a solution for all the problems of security in the world for the moment. Certainly there is a problem on extension, and I said what I said, I don't want to repeat it. But Europe, the construction of Europe, would take a long time. We started 40 years ago, and I was very glad that Hans-Dietrich has mentioned that it was necessary to have a very deep and strong relation between France and Germany after all these wars, 3 wars, that we started again to construct something peaceful and to have a new continent, not an old one, but a new one. But it will take some time. Look at what we have done with the Maastricht Treaty. We are still 3 years after the signature. We are still discussing on the monetary union, the currency, European currency. We are still discussing on the defense and external policy. So it is a long, long way to construct. And it will be quite frankly very useful if the Americans have in mind that it is necessary to have a strong Europe to have a very good equilibrium for stability. Now I come to the extension. One word. I think after the end of the Cold War, the countries of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and so on, have 2 interests. One is to join the community, the European Union, because it means for them prosperity. Second, to join the alliance because it means security. So we have to find a way to give an answer to these main questions of these countries: prosperity, security. And at the same time, we have to look after not to disturb the rest of the region, especially Russia. If we can find a way to respond to this preoccupation, security, prosperity, will make a very large step on the construction of Europe from to Vancouver, is in Europe, I think, to Vladivostok. This is a good dimension for Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. General Powell, in light of what the Minister has just said, and also taking into account Russian national sensitivities about an extension of NATO eastward, do you feel, sir, that NATO should be expanded to include Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary?
Let me make one point first about neo-isolationism. I think it is something we have to be concerned about, but I also think it's something that's manageable. I mean, from the time I became chairman in '89, with a troop strength of some 310,000 troops in Europe, we were able to draw it down to about 150,000 with congressional support. There was always a little bit of nagging at the margins, but for the most part, we were able to make the case that we had to keep a presence in Europe, and it has now gone down to 100,000, but I think it's not a number that's being challenged. Similarly, we were able even to stop our drawdowns. I think Paul Wolfowitz in the State Department made the recommendation, stop our drawdowns in Asia because we were concerned about the Korean situation, and I think there's general agreement that we have to keep the number of troops in the Pacific that we have. So although there are these neo-isolationist trends, I still think it is possible to manage them and keep our presence overseas. With respect to the expansion of NATO, why do these nations wish to join NATO? And the real reason is the United States of America. I mean, the United States of America is the bulwark of security to the West, and those nations of the East that are now free want to become part of that grand alliance that includes North America, that includes Canada, and especially the United States of America. And so I think NATO ultimately should be expanded. The question is at what rate, how fast should you go into this? and under what terms. You have to remember we're modifying a treaty, and we're committing the full faith of the American people to the defense of these new nations under whatever circumstances they happen to be attacked. And that case has not yet been made with the American people to undertake such obligations. I think there's some time required for that, especially since these nations are not in any immediate danger, in my view. And we also have to remember that one of our principal strategic objectives at this time is to keep Russia moving forward down a path toward an increasingly stable democracy, more market reform, creating a society based on law. And I think it's not a simple thing to just say, well, the heck with their sensibilities or their sensitivities or whatever might be going on. Let's just do it and get it over with.
Exactly, and if you had to balance
I think you have to balance it, and I
other.
think you have to take the time to balance it. And of course, my two colleagues on the right also suggested that maybe we start with a European-based model first, and that's worthy of debating. But I see no reason why NATO should not be expanded. I just don't know that it has to be done right away. I think we can take our time, do it right, prepare the American people, make sure these nations are truly worthy of entry into the alliance, prepared to fulfill their defense obligations and other obligations as members of the alliance.
Thank you very much. Paul Wolfowitz and Dr. Keller.
Just a historical footnote that I think is relevant, and that is the last time NATO was enlarged was when Eastern Germany was brought into NATO. And I remember when the wall first came down, and suddenly the prospect of unified Germany, which everyone had thought was something impossible, suddenly began to be a reality. Many people said, well, the only way Germany can be unified, or rather the only way the Soviet Union will permit Germany to be unified, is if Germany is neutral. And Secretary Baker and Foreign Minister Genscher took a different position, a position that at the time some people said was absurd and impossible, that a unified Germany should be part of NATO. I'm a little intimidated in mentioning this experience with these two men here. They could say it in more detail, but what took place was a process of a year of convincing the Soviet Union that, in fact, stability in Europe would be served by a unified Germany and NATO, and that stability in Europe was in their interest. And I think as one approaches this issue, one should not simply assume that Russian perceptions are fixed and in concrete, and certainly one should not assume that Russian perceptions are represented by General Lebed or Mr. Zhirinovsky. The enlargement of NATO is not, in fact, a threat to Russia. That it is perceived as a threat is something one has to deal with, but I think one deals with it in the larger context that Minister Genscher described, and a context that makes it clear that we have something in mind more than just enlargement, that we have things in mind that are very relevant to Russia's own security.
Dr. Keller, I have a question from a member of the audience with respect to the question of NATO expansionism, and it's right on target in terms of what we've been discussing now. Should the U.S. be prepared to go to war to protect Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary? That would have to be part of your calculation if we were to expand NATO and bring it into the fold, since an attack on one is presumed to be an attack on all.
This is a personal view. I think that the expansion of NATO, which is implied in the question, has to do with the offering of the Article 5 guarantee. If we do, in fact, offer membership to these countries, then we, in fact, are committed to that, we and all the other members of the alliance. I should also say, because it would be missing otherwise, is they are also committed to going to the defense of all of the other members of the alliance. And here perhaps I can just give you one anecdote out of this Partnership for Peace activity. We have something that's called the Program Analysis and Review, when in parallel with the NATO countries that make all of the details, major details of their defense budgets known to their allies. So we asked the partners, those that chose to do so, to make all of the details of their budgets available on the issues of peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, and search and rescue. And almost uniformly, the partner states said, we'll be happy to tell you people in NATO, but we don't want to tell our neighbors. We don't want to have the situation in which we are now open and transparent to those in our neighborhood. And we argued successfully in the end, but it took almost a year, that in fact that was the requirement of being that transparent and that committed to transparency in others at the same time? I think this is really the question, and it hasn't yet been solved. My personal opinion is it will be solved, but not in the short term.
Professor Russert, do you believe that the Congress of the United States would be prepared to redraft the NATO treaty so that the U.S. would come immediately to the defense of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary?
Well, I think in considering that, there are 2 points that maybe haven't been made sufficiently. One is that the question, which was just asked Professor Kelleher, is an appropriate one, except the question, should the United States be prepared to go to war to defend, should include the word nuclear war, because of course that's where the Russians still maintain a major capability, and we now don't feel threatened by that Russian nuclear capability, but we're positing a circumstance where it might become more relevant to our calculations. Secondly, when you draw a line including some people in an alliance, you implicitly draw a line that does not include certain people in an alliance. And if the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary are included under the NATO umbrella, what does that say about the commitment or lack of it to Slovakia or the Baltic states?
What does it say?
Or if the Baltic states are included, what does that say about the status of the Ukraine? Would we in effect be saying people who are under the NATO umbrella are protected, people who aren't? The Russians can do as they will. Is that a message?
But in the absence of an obvious or even apparent Soviet-Russian threat to Poland at this point, General Powell was saying nothing is imminent, what then is the need to transform the NATO alliance to take these countries into account?
I am implying that there isn't.
Okay. Thank you. Ralph Begleiter.
I just wanted to make a brief point to underline what General Powell and Hans-Dietrich Genscher said a moment ago, which is that if you're going to expand NATO, and if you're going to create new institutions in Europe in which the United States will continue to play an active role, you politicians have a heck of a selling job to do in the United States and in Russia. And I would argue, I think Minister Genscher may have had the right idea when he suggested there's a need for a study, but I think it needs to be a quick study, and the popular opinion development matter needs to be dealt with sooner rather than later. I don't think the neo-isolationism trends in the United States or in Russia should be allowed to fester very long. If these policy trends are going to be carried out, you better get cracking soon and start selling.
Professor Van Creveld.
I hate to be the odd man out here, but it's a habit. Listening to the discussion, I must say that much of it strikes me as almost irrelevant to the real problems of the last decade of the 20th century. Expanding NATO, adding some more countries to it, is not going to solve or indeed to do anything about the actual conflicts that now exist, that now rage in so many places around the world, including in some of the countries that maybe one day may be members. How, for instance, is the expansion, or for that matter, the contraction of NATO going to affect what is going on in Chechnya? How, for example, is the expansion of NATO, we include Poland, we include Hungary, how is that going to affect Bosnia? Or Macedonia in the future, maybe one day. How is the expansion of NATO going to affect the maybe mini-civil war that may be coming in France, or the problems that France has with Algeria, or for that matter, the Turkish problems with the fundamentalists and the Kurds, or for that matter, the Basque problem, and so on and so on. The answer is, we're talking about two different things here. They just are not tangential to each other. They don't matter. They are almost entirely separate from each other. It has been said here before that we should not make the mistake of treating these people, guerrillas, terrorists, freedom movements, whatever we call them, as war. Well, it reminds me of this young student who asked me not so long ago, Professor Van Creveld, why are you always talking about war? I'm not interested in war. And the answer, of course, is, my dear lady, you may not be interested in war, but war may be interested in you. And that would be my answer here too. Thank you.
Let me pick up a question. Let me pick up a question from our audience, which flows directly from what Professor Van Creveld has just said. Quote, is the consensus of the panel to throw out Dr. Van Creveld's suggestion that civil disturbances of rather great proportions are indeed a new view of what war might become?
Well, you know, Marvin, I disagreed with it from the start. I still disagree with it. I know it's a type of conflict, and we have problems. But if we in this country and other people in other countries consider dealing with civil disturbances of various kinds from the point of view of warfare, of using force, this is not going to solve those problems. It's going to make them worse, in my opinion, much worse. And yes, you have to protect the body politic against people throwing bombs or blowing up things, but I don't think that that is equated with the kind of concept that we think about when we think about a war. In this country, unfortunately, we throw around the word war with a great frequency. War on poverty, war on ignorance, and so forth. These are not really wars. It's a way of saying we mobilize ourselves to deal with those things. And I think that distinction, at least in my mind, is one that we need to bear in mind.
Dr. Herman, would you like to comment?
Well, there's one area of domestic conflict that seems to me that we have to wrestle more with, and that is where states exercise what amounts to genocide against part of their population. And it seems to me in those cases, as we end the 20th century, we surely have to ask ourselves whether there aren't cases where we need to think about international intervention in exactly those kinds of situations, even though they aren't interstate conflicts in the way that we've been thinking about them. I must say I'm a bit frustrated by this panel. I just want to just quickly say I understand the orientation of this panel because of our distinguished guests, but as I see students out there, and we have a panel with the label, The Future of Warfare, I think it's very important to recognize where has the United States deployed forces recently? What are the states you would think about, you would call rude states that have very little respect for international law? Where do you think the greatest population growth is going to be? Where are our greatest expansion in trade states? Where do we get most of our oil? There are regions of the world outside of Europe which pose very serious problems for international conflict as we approach the end of the century. And I'd hope no one will leave the room thinking that it is only the critical problems of Europe and the expansion of Europe that we need to be addressing.
Thank you very much for that comment. It's a good cautionary comment. Good comment. General Powell, these words were not said directly, but there was an implication in a number of things said this morning by President Bush and Secretary Baker concerning the role of the United States at this point. And I think a lot of us are puzzled by that. The Cold War is over, and during the Cold War we had containment. It was an easily defined objective, and whether it fit in or not, any number of our problems were said to be in response to the Soviet threat. At this point, in the absence of that kind of threat, what is the United States supposed to be seen as? Again, turning to the students, are they to be thinking of their country as the policeman of the world? If it's not the role of the policeman of the world, then what is it? And how can it be defined in a way that is comprehensible?
I don't know that we will come up with a single strategy that will cover all of the situations that are out there. I think it's very unlikely. I think that as these situations arise, they will be dealt with on an ad hoc basis, and they will be dealt with in the politics of the time that they arise. Some of them will appeal to a regional interest that we may have, places where there are oil or resources or something else that is important to us, not a vital interest, but a regional interest. And sometime our humanitarian instincts will be so struck that we feel we have to do something. Haiti, Bosnia. But I don't see any rush to go to Sierra Leone, where an entire state has collapsed before our eyes under the circumstances that Dr. Van Kriebel was talking about. Or Liberia, an even more tragic situation, which we essentially said to the Organization of African States, you figure it out. And we didn't go anywhere near it except to post some Marines offshore to protect our embassy. So I think each one of these is going to be dealt with in a very situational way, in accordance with what regional interests you might have or how severely pricked by Ralph Begleiter and his colleagues our humanitarian instincts are at that time, and what the politics of the situation will permit.
You've said
my experience in recent years is that when one of these comes along, it is still a good idea to make sure that you understand what your interest is or interests are. You set clear objectives of what it is you're trying to accomplish, and then you try to get it done as quickly as possible and try to make it as broad a coalition as you can if time permits and if it's possible to put such coalitions together. But the American people are still as willing to sacrifice as they have ever been. They're still as willing to send their sons and daughters into danger and to lose them. But you'd better be able to explain why they lost their lives. You'd better be able to answer the invariable, intense questioning you will get from the Congress when one of these tragedies happens. And if you can't rest your actions on a solid base of policy and interest, you will run into difficulty and you'll find yourself in an unsupportable situation. If it's just peacekeeping, like sitting in the Sinai for 12 or 20 years as we have been doing with an infantry battalion, fine. Once the casualties start coming, you better have a sound policy that represents an interest that the American people think is theirs.
But doesn't it severely restrict the capacity of the government then to move?
It restricts.
You've got to define so much in advance. You almost have to know the result.
You can move. You can move as quickly as you want. We lost a Marine in Panama City on a Saturday night, and the next day, 14 hours later, we decided to invade and take down the whole country. So you can move quickly, but you better make sure you have a clear objective of what you're trying to accomplish, and you better be prepared to have a policy that you can sustain over time with the American people. Somalia was another case where we had a good policy going in, a humanitarian policy. It was enormously successful. We stopped the deaths of tens of thousands of people. And then in a noble effort, we tried to get involved in a humanitarian effort that really turned into nation building. And then we started to have our policy difficulties, and our policy got a little unclear, and then when we suffered that tragic incident on the 3rd of October, and we lost those great 18 young men, the policy couldn't stand that. The American people no longer understood what we were trying to do, and the policy changed within 48 hours. And so you'd better be careful before you insert yourself into a situation if you're unable over time to explain the purpose of the intervention of the American people.
Thank you, General. I have a question. It's also from the audience for... Thank you. This question is for Ministers Genscher and Duma. What practical steps can be taken to limit the spread of nuclear weapons from the former Soviet Union? There is action that is now underway, and I wonder to what extent, Dr. Keller, you might want to start us on this, and perhaps the ministers could pick it up. Thank you.
I was going to say that this is an action that is, at least in general, well underway at this point under some programs that started that Secretary Baker and President Bush took a lead with and that have been carried forward. We now have, in fact, retired from Belarus, from the Ukraine and from Kazakhstan most of the nuclear weapons that were there and taken them back in a way that will ensure both secure storage and eventual destruction. I think a number of the countries throughout the West, largely through cooperative steps, some of them within NATO, some elsewhere, have taken steps to help the Russians with the problem of accounting for nuclear material, for making sure that weapons laboratories have come under some form of control, and especially that Russian scientists in particular are given the money and the wherewithal, the access to colleagues in the West, but also the ability to stay in Russia if they choose, without being, shall we say, subject to some of the great temptations that a number of the pariah states have put in their way. So far, as far as I'm aware, the record has been a very good one. It's something on which Germany, France, the United States, and others have really cooperated at every level with a great deal of efficiency, not a lot of publicity, and with considerable amount of success.
Would you like to add to that, Minister Duma, Mr. Genscher?
Yes, I would like to add that I remember that we signed some treaties in the years 90s. And as far as I received information from the specialists, I think it takes a long time before we reach the results of the disarmament for nuclear weapons. And there is two problems. One is the problem of the control, which is a difficult problem. And the second is to ensure that we can destroy this amount of weapons we decide to destroy in a very good condition, which is a second problem, serious one. But it takes some years. I remember in the years 91, 92, we were talking about 10 years. But if we reach, as I hope, this aim, we can imagine that we start in a new step to have a new treaty for new disarmament. It is not impossible in the international context.
Minister Genscher, do you want to come in on that?
No, I would agree with that.
Okay, good. Well, our last question then, as time ticks on here, is also from the audience. Will the rise of China require a new containment policy in the Far East? I assume that would be directed at someone responsible for U.S. policy. How about our professors? Professor Russett, Wolfowitz.
I'll take a try at it. I think the rise of China does present us very serious issues, including military issues, because I think as China becomes an economic superpower, and it is heading to become one, it is probably going to become a military superpower as well. But the solution is not to have a new Cold War in Asia. As someone said, it was bad enough to have a Cold War with the Soviet Union, which was a collapsing economy. It'd be terrible to have a Cold War with China. I think that's absolutely right. The goal is to integrate China successfully into a system that we can all live with in Asia, in fact in the world, and I think it's going to be one of the great challenges of the next century.
Professor Russett?
I agree with my colleague, absolutely.
Good. In that case, we are going to end our second panel right now. With my sincere thanks to our panelists for their wonderful comments and to our audience for being so attentive and polite. Thank you all very, very much.